You probably don't think much about church bells. But in the town of Penwood, population 3,104, everyone noticed when one morning in 1997, the bell at St. Gertrude's didn't ring. It had rung every morning since 1894. At 6:00 a.m., it was supposed to chime out 6 times, a signal to farmers and early risers, a quaint tradition that had embedded itself so deeply into local life that it became more reflex than ritual. Coffee brewed when the bell rang. The grocery truck left its lot when the bell rang. People started their day when the bell rang. So when it didn't, the town noticed. At first, it was a conversation piece, a few chuckles. Someone joked it was the sign of the apocalypse. But as hours passed and the silence continued into the evening, whispers turned into questions. And the next morning, still no bell. By day 3, the questions turned to something else. Where is the bell? A bell isn't something that just disappears. The copper alloy bell weighed just under 600 pounds. It hung in a narrow steeple with no elevator, no simple hoist system, and no external ladder. The church's front door was always locked overnight. Its rear exit was bricked over sometime in 1957. The window above the altar was stained glass and too narrow for a human being to fit through. And yet the bell was gone. Completely. Not broken, not dislodged and fallen into the nave. Gone. The parish priest, Father Elijah Mandel, was the first to raise concern. Initially, he thought the rope had snapped. It hadn't. The rope was coiled neatly, untied and unused. The mechanism for ringing it was intact. The clapper inside the bell, what makes it ring, was also missing. But no one had heard a thing. Who would want it? The bell wasn't valuable in the traditional sense. It wasn't made of pure bronze or gold. It had no engravings, no jewel insets, and no artistic value outside of sentimental tradition. An appraiser would likely quote it at under $2,000 for scrap metal. But in Penwood, it was priceless. The police filed an incident report out of formality. But even Officer Jody Barnes, who had been on the force for 17 years, seemed at a loss. "Where do you start?" she would say later. "You can't issue a bolo for a 600-pound bell." Local locksmiths hadn't been called for church maintenance in over 6 months. No contractors had logged permits to work on the steeple. Nobody recalled any unusual activity around the church. Then came the question nobody wanted to ask. Was it an inside job? Eyes on the church. The steeple was examined. There was no damage. The beams hadn't been disturbed. Dust patterns in the belfry floor were intact, except for a single triangular smear like the print of a shoe, wiped partially clean. Father Mandel allowed investigators to inspect the keys. Only 3 existed, one with him, one with the church deacon, and one secured in a deposit box at the local bank. All accounted for. The parish records were reviewed. Over the past few weeks, there were no signs of unusual tithes, donations, or entries for maintenance workers. But something odd did show up in the guest book. A name, written in unfamiliar handwriting, entered 4 days before the disappearance. B. Crandell. No one by that name was known in the town. No one recalled seeing the visitor, and no other guests had signed in that day. Father Mandel admitted that on that day, he was attending a diocesan meeting in a neighboring county. The church had been closed, and the deacon had been home recovering from knee surgery. So how had B. Crandell signed in? The newspaper archive. The town's newspaper, the Penwood Ledger, was still a weekly print operation in 1997. Reporter Deb Ellis, who had once written obituaries, editorials, and classifieds all in the same day, was curious enough to dig deeper. Her research turned up something unexpected. Back in 1972, the town's previous church bell, an earlier, smaller version, had also gone missing. That case had never been solved. The bell had simply vanished during a summer thunderstorm, and though theories had been floated lightning strike, collapse, even alien abduction, it quietly faded into history. A new bell, the current one, was commissioned in 1974. Could the cases be connected? And why did no one remember the first disappearance? Deb Ellis published her column under the headline, "A Bell, a Name, and a History Forgotten." The town's reaction was divided. Some considered it a conspiracy theory. Others whispered of generational secrets, suppressed by years of small-town silence. But a few older residents began remembering the name, Crandell. Not B. Crandell, but Bert Crandell, a traveling bell appraiser from decades earlier. He had visited during a regional restoration initiative in the 1970s. One elderly woman, Beatrice Mayer, age 89, recalled his name clearly. He had been obsessed with the acoustics of Penwood's steeple. She remembered how he'd spoken about resonant artifacts and historic frequency footprints. Her description seemed bizarre at first, but it led Officer Barnes to request archived property records, and what she found changed the direction of the investigation entirely. An abandoned property, 12 miles from Penwood, in the woods near the county line, stood a long-abandoned shed once belonging to Bert Crandell. The property had changed hands several times but remained largely untouched. A request for a search warrant was granted, and a team arrived 3 days later. Inside, beneath sheets of rusting corrugated tin, they found antique radio equipment, dozens of labeled recordings on reel-to-reel tape, pages of handwritten acoustic measurements, but no bell. Not the 1997 one, not the 1972 one. Just a single drawing, a mechanical sketch of a church bell's interior structure, and beside it a penciled note. The sound is more than tone, it's memory. A theory emerges. It would take weeks of review, interviews, and follow-ups for a theory to coalesce. Crandell, the bell appraiser, had once been affiliated with a now-defunct group called the Acoustic Preservation Society. Their goal: to record and preserve endangered sounds. Not musical notes, but unique resonances of places, library echoes, rail station acoustics, and church bell tones. The Penwood bell, according to one document, was believed to produce a perfect acoustic triad due to the shape of the steeple, the elevation of the town, and the mineral content of local air moisture. Something no other bell did. In their eyes, it wasn't just a bell, it was a sonic artifact. But could this be enough reason to steal it? And if Crandell was already dead, he'd passed away in 1995, according to death records. Then who was B. Crandell in 1997? A relative, a copycat, or someone continuing a forgotten obsession? Unanswered questions. Was the bell taken for profit, preservation, or something stranger? Why did two disappearances decades apart mirror each other so closely? Who is B. Crandell, and why did they sign the guestbook that day? When you lose something as ordinary as a bell, you expect it to show up somewhere. A pawn shop, a scrapyard, even left in a field by thieves who found it too heavy to move. But Penwood's missing bell never surfaced. Instead, the search turned from where the bell was to why it was taken. And that question led to places stranger than anyone in town expected. Following the Crandell trail, the name B. Crandell was all investigators had to work with. In the 1970s, Bert Crandell was already known in certain academic circles. He wasn't a criminal, not exactly, more of an eccentric. He'd been a consultant for museums, helping authenticate antique bells by analyzing their sound waves. His specialty wasn't metallurgy or sculpture, it was resonance. Bert believed bells carried the fingerprints of history, that their overtones captured something about the moment they were first rung, a kind of sonic time capsule. Most experts dismissed him, but he'd made a few headlines in small journals, and his work was cited in a little-known paper, Resonant Memory, The Acoustics of Human Spaces, 1976. That paper claimed certain bells had memory tones that could trigger human recall more vividly than smells, photographs, or diaries. It was pseudoscience to most. But in Penwood, people were beginning to wonder if someone believed in it strongly enough to steal. The journal in the shed. Back at the abandoned Crandell property, police found a water-damaged notebook. Its cover read, Field Notes, 1971-1978. Inside were sketches of bell towers across the Midwest, handwritten charts of frequencies, and passages like these. Penwood exceptional. Weathering introduces subtle third overtone, may be only surviving example. Must preserve before careless hands replace rope, shift timber, alter pitch. Sound is history. Once silenced, memory dies with it. But one entry stood out. Family will continue if I cannot. It was dated June 1974, 2 years after the first Penwood bell had gone missing. And just a few pages later, a crude family tree was drawn. No details, just initials. BC Burt, right arrow RC, right arrow BC. The initials matched B. Crandell. Small town leads. For weeks, Officer Barnes and her small team followed dead ends. No scrap dealers reported anything like a church bell. No antique markets carried word of it. Then a tip came from a retired railway worker named James O'Malley. He claimed that a few nights after the disappearance, he'd seen a flatbed truck moving slowly along the county highway at 3 a.m. On the truck, something large covered by a tarp with a distinctive curve. Could have been a silo part, he admitted, but it had the look of a bell. He hadn't reported it sooner because, in his words, who the hell steals a bell? The truck had no plates, no company logos, just a smear of mud across the rear. Academic curiosity. Around the same time, Deb Ellis, the town reporter, contacted a professor of ethnomusicology at Indiana University, Dr. Corinne Whitmore. When shown the Crandell notes, Dr. Whitmore was fascinated. Crandell wasn't wrong, she said. There are bells with unique resonances. Certain alloys struck in particular climates produce sound waves you won't find anywhere else. But to suggest they store memory, that's folklore, not science. Still, she admitted something chilling. Collectors exist, not for money but for possession, to own what no one else can hear. That bell might never ring again, not because it was destroyed, but because someone wants it silent. Her words spread through Penwood, theories blossomed. A private collector, a shadow society of sound archivists, even whispers of a government experiment in acoustic weapons. The town, once skeptical, now leaned into speculation. The Bell Archive connection. Then came the breakthrough. A junior officer digging through archival police correspondence found a letter addressed to Penwood in 1973. It was from something called the Bell Archive, based in Cincinnati. The letter inquired about potential acquisitions for historical preservation. Specifically, it listed 3 towns, including Penwood, as locations of bells with rare tonal structures. The archive had since dissolved, but some of its members were known, including, unsurprisingly, Burt Crandell. If the organization had folded, where had its assets and its obsessions gone? Digging into the family. The Crandell family, sparse in records, proved difficult to trace. Burt had never married, at least officially, but there were whispers of a nephew. A local census from the 1980s listed a Raymond Crandell in Ohio. He fit the RC in Burt's sketch, but Raymond had died in 1991. Raymond, however, had a son, Benjamin B. Crandell. The signature in the Penwood guestbook suddenly carried weight. The silence of Benjamin. Finding Benjamin wasn't simple. He had no stable address, no driver's license history. But through postal forwarding records, Deb Ellis tracked him to a small town in Kentucky. When police made contact, they found a man in his late 30s, unemployed, living in a rented trailer, quiet, withdrawn. When asked about the Penwood Bell, Benjamin denied everything. But investigators noted something odd. In the corner of his trailer sat a stack of reel-to-reel tapes, the same kind found in Bert's shed. One was labeled simply Penwood. No one ever confirmed what was on it. Legal limits prevented seizing the tapes without probable cause, and Benjamin refused consent. But the discovery was enough to ignite suspicion across town. The missing sound. As the weeks passed, something stranger emerged. Older residents claimed they could still hear the bell, faintly, on certain mornings. Phantom chimes just at dawn. Was it imagination, auditory memory, or something more? One woman insisted she heard the bell on the very day her husband passed away. Another swore it rang during a summer storm, though the tower was empty. The reports were impossible to verify, but they kept the mystery alive. A community divided. By the end of that year, Penwood had changed. Half the town wanted to move on, to stop chasing ghost bells. The other half felt robbed of something irreplaceable. Attendance at St. Gertrude's dwindled. The morning routines shifted. Without the bell, the rhythm of the town fractured. Meanwhile, a single unanswered question haunted every conversation. Was Benjamin Crandell the one who carried on his grandfather's obsession? And if so, what had he done with the bell? Unresolved thought. If the Penwood Bell was never meant to be heard again, then was the crime theft at all, or was it preservation, in the strangest form imaginable? Some crimes solve themselves. Others are solved by diligence, by pressure, by one person asking the right question at the right time. But then there are crimes like the Penwood Bell theft without witness, motive without clarity, a mystery that deepens each time it's investigated. By the time winter came in 1998, nearly a year after the bell vanished, the case had gone cold. But the town hadn't forgotten. And then something strange happened. A sound unearthed. In December, Dr. Corinne Whitmore from Indiana University reached out again. She had received a package with no return address. Inside was a single reel-to-reel tape marked Penwood 6:00 a.m. December 5, 1994. It had been mailed from somewhere in central Kentucky. She played it. The tape contained a clear, undisturbed recording of the St. Gertrude's bell, just 6 chimes in the morning stillness. But what stunned her was the clarity. No ambient noise, no birds, no wind, just the bell in crisp resonance. It was as though the sound had been preserved in a vacuum. She contacted Officer Barnes. A copy was delivered to the department, and the file was played during a town meeting in early January. The room fell silent as the sound rang through the speakers. One elderly man was seen wiping his eyes. "It's like it's still here," he said. Magnifying glass tilted left the quiet admission. With mounting suspicion and public curiosity peaking again, police reapproached Benjamin Crandell in Kentucky. This time, he agreed to an informal conversation. No cameras, no legal pressure. What followed was perhaps the closest thing to a confession the town would ever get. Benjamin spoke slowly, cautiously. He referred to his grandfather as a man who believed in preservation, not theft. He admitted that he had visited Penwood briefly and had entered St. Gertrude's during a time the back door had been left unlocked for a scheduled cleaning. The deacon, still recovering from surgery, hadn't arrived yet. He didn't say how the bell was removed. He didn't say where it was. He only said this: "I didn't steal it, I archived it." The detectives were left speechless. He wouldn't elaborate. And legally, there was no proof of a crime. The church had no security footage. The back door had indeed been unlocked that day, and while suspicion was overwhelming, evidence was thin. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no trail. The tapes were privately owned, and Benjamin had not sold anything not for profit, not for fame. He had simply kept it. Hammer the sound vault. Later that spring, investigative journalist Deb Ellis visited an acquaintance in the sound archival community, a man who once worked with the now-defunct Bell Archive Project. Over coffee, he revealed something that reframed the entire case. Crandell didn't care about the bells, he said. He cared about what they represented. He thought memory was embedded in vibration, that if you preserved the sound of something at just the right moment, you could revisit it, like time travel but with acoustics. When asked what archiving a bell meant, he paused. There were rumors, he admitted, that some collectors were removing bells not to sell, but to silence them, believing the last chime preserved its most perfect tone. They wanted the final ring captured before the world changed it. Pollution, construction, even birds nesting nearby could affect the overtones. So they'd steal the bell, record it in isolation, and lock it away. Deb asked if he believed Benjamin Crandell had done that. He only shrugged. If anyone would, it's someone raised on Bert's ideas. Classical sent Gertrude's decision. After nearly 2 years of silence, the parish council at St. Gertrude's decided on a solution. A replica bell, cast to the original's dimensions, would be installed. But they wouldn't ring it. Instead, every morning at 6:00 a.m., speakers would play a recording of the original bell taken from the tape Dr. Whitmore had received. The idea was controversial. Was it authenticity or performance? Some residents loved it. Others felt it betrayed the memory of the real bell. But slowly, life in Penwood began to adjust. Coffee brewed at 6:01 again. Trucks left their lots. The rhythm, though synthetic, returned. And yet something remained missing. Because now the chime wasn't real. It was a memory. Lock the final visit. In 2001, a maintenance worker inspecting a private storage facility in Shelbyville, Kentucky, reported an odd item, an ornamental cast structure bolted to a wood pallet, covered in black canvas. When a manager checked the lease records, it was listed under a company name, Sonus Heritage, LLC, the mailing contact, a Benjamin C. The contents were never officially confirmed. No warrant was ever issued. But according to the worker's statement, the bell appeared. Aged with copper patina. Missing its clapper. Crated in a way that allowed it to be moved, but not rung. Police made no further inquiry. Legally, nothing could be done. Speech balloon reflections from the town. Over the years, the story of the Penwood Bell faded into town folklore. Children asked about it during school tour. A few postcards were sold in the general store, showing the old bell tower. Deb Ellis retired in 2004, Officer Barnes in 2007. But every now and then, someone would pause at 6:00 a.m. and listen not to the speaker, but to the silence that came just before it. That moment where, for a split second, the town waited. Waited to see if maybe, just maybe, the bell had come home. Brain the aftermath and the legacy. The case remains officially unsolved. No arrests were made, no charges filed. But the Penwood Bell story became a quiet case study in investigative psychology. Criminal justice programs began including it in coursework not because of its drama, but because of what it revealed about motive, about how not all crimes are about gain. Some are about belief, about meaning. It also raised ethical questions. Can theft be considered preservation if no harm was intended? If a community loses something material, but retains its memory what has really been stolen? St. Gertrude never replaced the replica with a real bell. And as of 2025, the whereabouts of the original remain unknown. Final reflection. In the end, perhaps the Penwood bell never truly vanished. Maybe it still rings not in steeples, but in memory. A quiet echo reminding us that the ordinary can become extraordinary, if only someone listens closely enough. It started with a letter. Not one that arrived, but one that didn't. In a small town called Hollow Creek, nestled between rolling hills in northern Vermont, a peculiar crime would unfold in the most mundane place imaginable, the local post office. The town's population never reached 2,000. The post office sat between a general store and a real estate office, and most days saw no more than a dozen visitors. And yet, in the fall of 2009, this sleepy branch became the center of a federal investigation that would span 5 states, involve obscure stamp collectors, a retiree with a locked basement, and a clerk with a secret she almost got away with. All over a few envelopes that never made it to their destination. A disappearing act. Clarence Morrow was known around Hollow Creek for 3 things. He wore the same plaid jacket year-round. He owned a pristine collection of rare U.S. stamps. He never missed his daily visit to the post office. At 78, Clarence lived alone in the house he'd grown up in. His stamp collection, spanning from the late 1800s to the mid-2000s, was his pride. Appraisers estimated it to be worth over $250,000, though Clarence would never sell a single piece. Instead, he spent his time trading quietly, carefully with other collectors across the country. In October 2009, Clarence sent 3 envelopes through the Hollow Creek post office. All were registered mail, insured and documented. Inside each, high-value trading stamps, including a rare inverted Jenny reproduction from 1918 and a 1902 Lincoln red misprint. 2 weeks later, all 3 recipients claimed they had never arrived. The slips were stamped, the tracking codes scanned, but the packages had vanished somewhere between Hollow Creek and their destinations. Clarence didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone. He just filed a formal complaint with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. And the dominoes began to fall. Detective federal attention. The USPS has its own law enforcement arm, the Postal Inspection Service. These agents don't just chase mail thieves, they investigate fraud, trafficking, and internal corruption. And when valuable insured parcels disappear in clusters, red flags go up quickly. Inspector Thomas Delaney arrived in Hollow Creek 2 weeks after the complaint was filed. A quiet man in his early 50s, Delaney had handled everything from eBay auction scams to international mail fraud rings. He expected this case to be simple. Usually it's misrouting or some junior employee opening a box out of curiosity, Delaney later told a reporter. This one felt different right away. The Hollow Creek branch had no video surveillance, no tamper alarms, and a staff of only 3. Delaney began interviews immediately. The postmaster, 63-year-old Gail Horner, had worked there for 22 years. "Nothing like this ever happens here," she said. "If you told me someone was stealing, I'd laugh. We don't even lock our vending machine." Yet someone had handled the envelopes. And someone had made them disappear. Open mailbox with raised flag patterns in the post. Delaney examined the logs. All 3 envelopes had been logged by the same clerk. Angela Angie Coate, age 42. Angie had worked the front desk since 2001. She was punctual, quiet, well-liked. She brought homemade zucchini bread every Friday. Her personnel record was clean, no complaints, no infractions. But her reaction to Delaney's questions was unusually defensive. She claimed she remembered Clarence's packages. They were registered, yeah, I remember the stickers, but said she had followed all protocol. She handed over the transaction logs, signed forms, tracking slips. And yet the barcode logs revealed something odd. 2 of the packages had been scanned in, but not scanned out. They never entered the regional processing center, which meant they likely never left Hollow Creek. Receipt: the collector circuit. Delaney reached out to the recipient's 3 stamp collectors in Oregon, Michigan, and Georgia. Each confirmed the trades with Clarence. Each had communicated with him for years, and none had received the shipments. When asked if they had ever lost mail before, they all said no. Then something happened that widened the case. One of the collectors, Darren Croft from Ann Arbor, mentioned something strange. "I once bought a small lot from a reseller on an obscure forum, a Vermont address. Same kind of rare issues Clarence has. I thought it was just coincidence." He still had the packaging. The return label had no name, just a P.O. box in East Grafton, Vermont, about 40 minutes from Hollow Creek. Delaney contacted the East Grafton post office. That P.O. box was registered to M. LeClaire, a name not connected to any known stamp seller. But when they pulled the payment history, the credit card used for the box was linked to Angela Coates' husband. The confrontation. Confronted with this information, Angie Coates' demeanor changed. She didn't deny it. She simply asked, "Is this really a federal thing now?" Delaney pressed, was she selling stamps from intercepted mail? Was she using the P.O. box to ship them anonymously? She didn't respond directly. Instead, she said, "I wasn't taking from strangers, just stuff that was insured. It's not like they weren't covered." It was an admission, not full, not clear, but enough. Delaney secured a warrant for the Coate residence. Houses behind the basement door. Agents arrived at the Coates' home the next morning. In the basement, they found a locked filing cabinet, a temperature-controlled drawer, and 5 black binders, all filled with stamps. The total appraised value, $43,000. Among them, 2 of Clarence Morrow's missing items. Angie claimed she only took duplicates, that she was preserving them, that stamp collecting was how she stayed sane. She'd never intended to sell most of them, she said, only the lower value ones. But records from online sales platforms showed otherwise. She had sold over 130 packages in the last 2 years under the alias ML Archivist 74. Dozens matched descriptions from previously reported missing parcels across Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. And many were registered shipments from known collectors. Brain: the psychology of quiet crimes. During interviews, Angie Coate never raised her voice. She seemed calm, methodical, regretful but not remorseful. Experts would later refer to her as a case study in intimate fraud, crimes committed not for thrill or need, but for quiet, sustained gratification. Stamp collecting was her escape. The packages, she said, were just floating there in the system. Nobody else cared about them, she said, but I did. It wasn't about money, she insisted. It was about having something valuable just for herself. Unresolved thought. What drives someone to betray trust for something so niche? In a system designed for reliability, is it the predictability that makes it vulnerable? Sometimes the most damaging crimes aren't loud. They don't involve broken windows or getaway cars. They don't make headlines or inspire fear. Instead, they happen slowly, methodically, just a few stamps at a time. Angela Coates' quiet thefts, buried inside hollow routines and automated trust, were just that, invisible until someone like Clarence Morrow noticed. But what Clarence didn't know was that his complaint would uncover one of the most quietly effective postal frauds the region had ever seen. File folder: the scope unfolds. When agents examined Angie Coates' basement collection, what looked at first like a hobbyist stash became something much more organized. Each binder was labeled not by country or date, but by postal origin. Maine Portland, New Hampshire Concord, Vermont Rutland, Vermont Hollow Creek, Misc outgoing. Inside were sleeves of stamps, categorized by color coding, small printed labels tucked into each sleeve with notes like duplicate low value, worn edge minor crease, mint unsent, claimed lost 2023.08. Agents noticed something strange. Some stamps were marked with dates after they had gone missing. The implication: Coat had been tracking when packages were reported lost, likely using internal systems and keeping records. This wasn't impulse theft. It was a long game. Office building the internal loopholes. At a federal debriefing in Burlington, USPS investigators shared something alarming. Angie Coat had exploited two weaknesses in the small branch mailing system. Registered mail volume. Smaller towns like Hollow Creek had no built-in redundancy. If one clerk handled the mail, that clerk controlled the chain of custody, often with no second verification. Tracking delay windows. Many packages pass through local branches before being scanned into the regional hub. This created a 12-24-hour blind spot where mail was presumed in transit but had not yet been logged. Coat had learned to operate precisely within that window. She would scan packages in, but instead of placing them in the out bin, she would discreetly divert them into her personal tote bag or a second storage container she kept beneath the counter. Then she'd wait. If no complaints came, she'd reopen the packages weeks later. Anything valuable went into her private collection or anonymous online sales. The rest, burned in a backyard fire pit confirmed by ash samples and torn envelopes found during the home search. Receipt the collector victims. As news of the Hollow Creek incident spread quietly through collecting forums, more victims came forward. A man in Bangor, Maine realized he had lost two outgoing envelopes the previous year, both routed through a Vermont branch on their way south. A woman in Utica, New York claimed she had sent a rare 1933 Roosevelt stamp to a buyer in Florida. The package was insured, refunded, but the buyer never received it. The common thread. All of them had passed through small New England branches, serviced by Angie Coat's regional network. While she officially worked in Hollow Creek, she had covered shifts sometimes as a substitute clerk in other towns between 2009 and 2016. Federal inspectors began combing through parcel logs. One investigator referred to it as dusting for footprints on a frozen pond. What emerged was a trail of at least 42 suspicious missing item claims, all fitting Angie Coat's patterns. Chart decreasing financial fallout. Though stamp collecting might seem like a harmless hobby, the financial implications of the thefts were real. By conservative estimate, Coat had sold over $58,000 worth of stolen stamps online. Insurance claims filed due to her actions totaled over $34,000. The estimated market value of unsold stamps in her possession exceeded $70,000. Collectors were not reimbursed for emotional loss. Some had irreplaceable items, family heirlooms, or historically rare finds. One collector from Connecticut reported the loss of a Centennial Edition commemorative sheet signed by his grandfather, a WWII veteran. He told authorities, "It wasn't about the money, it was about the story behind it. That was the last letter he sent home before the war ended. Gone, burned perhaps, or filed away in a stranger's binder." Studio public reaction in Hollow Creek. When news of Angie Coat's arrest reached the town, reactions were mixed. Some were shocked. "She was so nice," said one woman. "She gave my daughter her first book of stamps." Others were defensive. "She's not a criminal," said her former coworker. "She just lost her way." But there were also those who felt betrayed. Clarence Morrow, who had unknowingly triggered the investigation, declined media interviews, but in a letter to a collecting forum, he wrote, I never wanted anyone hurt, but I do believe trust only matters when it's earned. She broke it. The post office saw a dip in traffic. 2 clerks quit. For a while, packages were taken directly to the next town over. Small towns don't forget easily. Balance the trial. Angela Coate was indicted on federal charges of mail theft, wire fraud, and possession of stolen property. During the trial, she appeared calm. She pled guilty to a reduced charge in exchange for full cooperation. She provided access to her sales records, her storage boxes, and her buyer list. Her defense: that she had succumbed to temptation, that she had always loved stamps, that she never thought anyone would miss them. She was sentenced to 32 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years supervised release. Clarence Morrow testified, quietly, firmly. She didn't take paper, he said. She took history. Speech ballooned the ethical questions. The case sparked discussion far beyond Vermont. In forums, news blogs, and postal industry conferences, questions emerged. How much trust should be placed in unmonitored systems? Should the USPS increase surveillance at smaller branches, even at the cost of community comfort? What drives someone to commit small, repeat offenses over years, especially when not driven by desperation? Experts in occupational fraud suggested this case fell under situational temptation, compounded by lack of oversight. In other words, she could, so she did. Package the system responds. In the wake of the trial, the USPS made changes. Dual clerk requirements. Registered mail now required 2 staff sign-offs at rural branches. Increased scanning discipline. Improved software logging precisely when and where parcels are handed off. Camera installs. Even the smallest post offices received surveillance installations. Fraud flagging AI. A beta program now tracks anomalies in shipment timing and weight logging. Angela Coate's case became the training example for internal integrity workshops. A crime that had gone unnoticed for over 6 years now stood as a case study in how small vulnerabilities can spiral into systemic breakdowns. Unresolved cliffhanger. One final question remains: where are the remaining stolen stamps that were never recovered? Several high-value items remain missing from the known sale logs. Were they sold under another alias? Or were they kept, hidden away in a collector's private vault, sealed in plastic, waiting for no one? 3 years after Angela Coate's conviction, the Hollow Creek Post Office had returned to a new kind of normal. The surveillance camera blinked softly above the counter now. Packages were double-logged, even for standard deliveries. Angela's name hadn't been spoken aloud in over a year. But something unusual happened on a cold Thursday morning in February 2018. A plain manila envelope arrived, no return address, addressed to Mr. Clarence Morrow, Hollow Creek, VT 5745. It had no stamps on it, only a USPS prepaid barcode, postmarked from a federal facility in West Virginia. Inside was a single plastic sleeve, and in it, the inverted Jenny reproduction Clarence had mailed back in 2009. After all the investigations, the court proceedings, the months of item recovery, this one had never been accounted for. Until now. The envelope nobody claimed. Clarence brought the envelope directly to the new postmaster, a younger man named Dean who had taken over after Gail Horner retired. Dean submitted it to federal agents. They examined the label, the ink, even the adhesive. There were no fingerprints, no latent prints, nothing traceable. But the barcode came back as part of a restricted outgoing batch mail sent by federal inmates. Angela Coate had been released just 6 months earlier. She'd never been required to return anything beyond what had already been seized. But here was a high-value stamp, pristine, encased, carefully packaged sent not long after her release. She denied sending it when asked, said she couldn't recall what she might have mailed from prison, that she had left everything behind. But the gesture felt deliberate. Not a confession, not an apology, just a return. Postbox quiet ripples. The inverted Jenny wasn't the only item to reappear. Over the next 2 years, 5 other packages trickled into the Hollow Creek post office, all addressed by hand, all with no return labels. Each contained 1 or 2 rare stamps, some of which were known losses from Angie's online sale logs. Others were unknown, likely from victims who never filed complaints. The postmarks varied, some from New Jersey, others from rural Pennsylvania or New Hampshire. All were domestic. All appeared to have been routed through drop boxes. Who sent them? No one could say for sure. Some believed Angie was returning them slowly to avoid detection. Others suspected an accomplice or relative perhaps. Even her husband had held back part of her collection. The items were logged and stored. When possible, they were matched to their original owners and returned. But many more remained missing. Open book Clarence's final letter. In 2019, at age 88, Clarence Morrow passed away peacefully in his sleep. He left behind his full stamp collection to the Vermont Historical Postal Society, a small volunteer-run museum in Brattleboro. Among the donation was a handwritten note, folded between the pages of his inventory binder. It read, "I built this collection over 60 years, not for its worth, but for the quiet joy of holding something that traveled so far, so silently. Some were stolen, some came back, but most of all they told stories." The museum curator later said Clarence's donation included not just stamps, but letters, maps, original postal scales, and even a working 1940s stamp press. It became the centerpiece of their exhibit titled, "Vanished and Returned, A Stamp's Journey Through Crime. Brain Lessons from a Quiet Crime." The Angela Coat case continued to ripple through professional circles. Postal training seminars used her story to teach behavioral detection in long-term employees, vulnerability mapping in small-town infrastructure, the psychology of non-violent, low-value crimes that add up over time. Experts noted that Angie had no known trauma, no major financial stress, and no accomplices. What she did have was access, opportunity, and obsession. Her case fell into a category known as low-disruption fraud, where the perpetrator deliberately avoids large-scale loss to prolong the crime undetected. And for nearly 6 years it worked. Balance the ethical gray. After her release, Angela Coat moved out of Vermont. Some said she changed her name. Others claimed she relocated to upstate New York. No official records confirmed either story. An investigative podcast later tried to reach her. The host received a reply, a typed letter, unsigned, but presumed to be from Angie. It said, "I still believe what I took was undervalued by the people who held it, not in price, but in care. I knew the meaning of what passed through my hands. Maybe that doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. I never meant to hurt anyone. But I did. And that's mine to carry." The host titled the episode, "Stamped Out, The Woman Who Took What Couldn't Be Replaced." End arrow long-term impact. By 2022, rural USPS branches across the Northeast had fully integrated. Redundant scanning, monthly auditing, community watch protocols. Collectors began using specialized digital tracking tools for their most valuable shipments, including blockchain tagging and smart packaging. Ironically, stamp collecting grew in popularity again, spurred by nostalgia and the strange allure of the Coat case. A new generation of collectors entered the scene. And in some corners, Angie Coat became a name both feared and curiously respected, a symbol of how one woman quietly shook the foundation of a system millions trust daily. Final reflection. What does it say about us that something as small as a stamp can carry so much meaning, that a single envelope can alter lives? In a world of rapid messages and digital signals, maybe that's why it still matters. A stamp travels slowly, silently, intentionally, and when it doesn't arrive, someone notices. Every small town has its factory. For the people of Elridge, Missouri, it was the Granger Foods plant, a modest red brick building with a single smokestack and a near-constant smell of chicken broth. It had stood at the end of Old County Road 7 for nearly 60 years. During peak season, it ran 3 shifts a day, canning soups, stews, and sauces under generic labels that ended up in discount stores and food banks across the Midwest. No one thought much about it until the fall of 2014. That's when nearly 27,000 cans of processed soup enough to fill 2 semi-trucks disappeared. No broken gates, no security footage, no employee reported seeing anything unusual. The inventory vanished quietly, and not a single can was ever recovered. To this day, what came to be known as the Elridge Soup Heist remains one of the most unusual thefts in American food production history. Factory a shift like any other. It started on a Thursday. On September 18, 2014, plant supervisor Greg Hanlon arrived at 6:30 a.m., coffee in hand, ready to oversee the early shift. He noticed nothing out of place, no trucks on the lot, no doors ajar. Inside, the crew prepped the day's production of corn chowder and beef barley. Routine, predictable. But as Hanlon checked the cold storage bay where finished product was housed before shipping, he stopped cold. An entire section 2, rack spanning 18 pallets, was empty. The cans, packaged, shrink-wrapped, and prepped for shipping the night before, were gone. Thinking it was a paperwork issue, he double-checked the logs. Nothing had been signed out. The overnight shift claimed they hadn't moved anything. And yet, 27,000 cans of shelf-stable soup, valued at approximately $82,000 wholesale, were no longer in the building. Delivery truck a phantom pickup. The Granger facility used a third-party distributor, Foster Freight, to handle logistics. Standard procedure required all truck pickups to be logged at the rear security station, and any driver had to present matching paperwork. That Thursday morning, there were no scheduled pickups, but a review of the paper sign-in log showed an entry from S. Carter, Foster Freight, at 2:48 a.m. No one remembered seeing the driver. The guard on duty that night, Eldon Prentice, 71 years old, insisted he hadn't let anyone through. "I sit right there," he told police. "Never saw a soul, and we didn't get no truck." But the signature was there, and it matched older logs from actual Foster Freight drivers. Sloppy cursive, familiar initials. Someone had forged it convincingly. Surveillance footage. Of course, the exterior cameras had been under maintenance for over a week. The request to repair them, filed by a junior maintenance contractor who didn't exist. Chart decreasing discrete loss. The theft wasn't discovered by authorities for several days. Internally, Granger attempted to verify whether the shipment had been misrouted or misplaced. Only after confirming with Foster Freight that no pickup was scheduled or completed did they contact local law enforcement. Detective Maria Ellison of the Elridge PD took the call. At first, she thought it was a clerical issue, maybe bad inventory, a mistake. But when she toured the storage bay herself and reviewed the logs, she realized this wasn't a simple case of miscounting. Someone had orchestrated the removal of an enormous quantity of product without leaving a trace. What's in a can? The stolen product wasn't glamorous. It was mostly generic canned soup, no brand names, no organic labels. The kind sold in discount bins or included in emergency food shipments. That made it hard to trace. Unlike high-end electronics or designer goods, canned food lacks serial numbers or identifying barcodes tied to a specific facility. If the cans were resold, it would be nearly impossible to distinguish them from identical-looking products in stores. It was, in other words, the perfect low-value, high-volume theft. Toolbox: the inside job theory. Detective Ellison's working theory. Someone inside the factory had helped coordinate the heist. She started with the shipping department. Only a few employees had access to shipping manifests and pickup schedules. One of them, Henry Mathies, a forklift driver, was known for picking up extra shifts, especially overnight. He'd been working the Wednesday night shift when the soup disappeared. When questioned, Henry seemed agitated. He claimed the pallets were there at midnight when he did his final round, but couldn't remember whether they were still there when he clocked out around 3 a.m. Security logs showed him leaving at 3:17 a.m., just 30 minutes after the forged sign-in. Coincidence? Ellison wasn't sure. But then she found something that changed the direction of the case. A gas station receipt from a town 115 miles away, timestamped just 4 hours after the theft. The card used belonged to Henry's brother. The vehicle, a rented box truck. Package: the black market soup trade. When word spread of the missing soup, journalists seized on the absurdity. "Soup gone cold," read one headline. "Campbell who? Elridge cans vanish in midnight caper," read another. But quietly, food redistribution groups and law enforcement began whispering about something more serious. There was a growing black market network that redistributed food products expired, stolen, or diverted through underground channels. Some of it ended up in prisons, overseas relief containers, or street-level discount vendors in major cities. An $82,000 shipment of shelf-stable soup could be flipped for twice that amount across hundreds of small-scale outlets, especially if no one asked questions. No traceable SKU, no recall, no attention. Just soup. Stop sign: the trail goes cold. Despite weeks of investigation, police found no direct evidence linking Henry Mathies to the truck or the missing product. The rental was made under his brother's name, who claimed he had lent it out, without asking questions. The truck had been returned, scrubbed clean, with no residue or cargo left inside. No fingerprints, no footage, no way to prove which truck had picked up the pallets that night. Granger Foods quietly wrote off the loss. Their insurance, while helpful, didn't fully cover theft on such a scale. Security policies changed. Cameras were fixed. Paper logs were replaced with biometric ID sign-ins. And the case was quietly closed. Unresolved thought. Who profits from a crime no one can trace, involving goods most people ignore? In a world obsessed with high-value theft, what happens when someone steals something so boring it slips through every crack? By the time the Granger soup theft was filed away as unsolved, the local police in Elridge were already moving on. Detective Maria Ellison was. She worked in bigger cities before, places where crime was constant, where patterns emerged fast, and where instincts were honed by volume. This was different. It was quiet, too quiet, like something was missing beyond just pallets of canned food. So she kept digging. What she found buried in warehouse logs, logistics journals, and insurance claims was that the soup theft wasn't a bizarre one-off. It was part of something bigger, something no one had been paying attention to. Package: the pattern begins. In early 2015, a food processing plant in Carbondale, Illinois, reported the unexplained loss of a full shipment of powdered mashed potatoes, 15 pallets. No sign-out, no security footage. In March of that same year, a warehouse in Paducah, Kentucky, noted a mislabeled dispatch that turned out to be missing canned tuna, also packaged for distribution under generic labels. Neither case made the news. The companies involved were mid-size, largely invisible to the public, and quietly handled their losses through insurance. When Ellison pulled the claims, both cases were described using near-identical phrasing. No forced entry, inventory marked as shipped but not received, no scheduled dispatch during the relevant window. She tracked 3 more across the region. Springfield, MO, instant noodles. Hopkinsville, KY, canned vegetables. Des Moines, IA, powdered drink mixes. Each involved bulk food product, usually generic, shelf-stable and destined for either food pantries, correctional facilities, or government resale contracts. The scale was small enough to avoid national attention, but consistent enough to suggest coordination. Adult briefcase and experts' insight. To make sense of the logistics, Ellison contacted Paul Dwyer, a former freight auditor and logistics consultant who had retired early after blowing the whistle on corruption in the bidding system for school lunch contracts. She met him in a diner outside Kansas City. Over lukewarm coffee, he reviewed the Granger case file and the new cluster of incidents she'd compiled. Dwyer didn't hesitate. "That's ghost routing," he said. "You're looking at a black market redistribution network. Quiet guys, never take name brands, don't get greedy. They steal stuff nobody audits closely: food banks, shelters, institutional buyers." He explained that by stealing non-branded food and replacing manifests with fakes, the perpetrators could resell stolen goods into underserved markets where traceability was low and documentation was often neglected. It's gray supply chain stuff. They don't go near supermarkets. They hit dollar stores, independent vendors, food trucks that pay cash. No receipts, no questions. He paused, then added, "And it's not just soup, it's a business model. Receipt the front company." Back in Elridge, Ellison received a tip. A local supplier had tried to order canned beef stew from an obscure bulk distributor out of St. Louis, a company named Midline Holdings. The shipment never arrived. When she looked up the business registration for Midline, she found no active website, no employee listings, a registered office in a warehouse complex on the outskirts of the city. When she visited, the space was empty, recently vacated. Neighbors said the operation had rented for 6 months, operated mostly at night, and had a rotating fleet of unmarked box trucks. Nothing unusual, they said, just looked like another distributor. She pulled the business paperwork. One of the signatures on the Articles of Incorporation. S. Carter, the same name forged on the Granger Foods shipping log. When theft is designed to disappear. Ellison tried to raise attention at the state level, but the response was tepid. "It's not fentanyl," one agent told her. "It's just food." But the implications were clear. Small quantities stolen from multiple locations. Faked logs and phantom drivers. Generic good resold into hard-to-trace channels. And no one was reporting it. Why? Because the victims, the factories and warehouses, were reluctant to admit internal failure, filing insurance claims quietly, avoiding press. This created the perfect vacuum. The thefts were too boring to chase, too small to prioritize, and too common to track. But cumulatively, Ellison estimated over $1.2 million in losses had occurred across just 7 facilities within 18 months. And still no arrests, no suspects. Derelict: the underground warehouse. In late 2015, Ellison partnered with a regional task force investigating a series of warehouse code violations near Jefferson City. One warehouse, flagged for improper refrigeration, was raided during a routine inspection. Inside, Pallets of unlabeled canned food. Stacks of shrink-wrap boxes marked only with shipping weights and batch codes. A single clipboard with purchase records, mostly cash transactions, small buyers. None of the items were reported stolen. No serials, no receipts, just anonymous surplus. But several cans matched lot codes from the Granger Foods plant, the soup stolen over a year ago. Who owned the space? The lease was signed by a shell company called Clear River Logistics. The listed contact, a disconnected number, and again, one of the alternate signatories. S. Carter. Brain a quiet network. The realization hit hard. This was never about any one theft. This was a low-noise, high-efficiency supply chain crime ring. They didn't need guns or masks or violence. Just a clipboard, a signature, and enough boredom to let them pass under the radar. They built a pipeline that quietly redirected essential goods from legitimate sources into shadow markets that would never question the origin. A parallel economy, running behind the shelves you see, feeding businesses you don't. Unresolved thought. If crime becomes indistinguishable from commerce, if a signature is all it takes to reroute the flow of thousands of goods, how do you catch someone who isn't stealing for themselves, but for a system? The name S. Carter was now threaded through 3 different crimes. Forged into a shipping log at Granger Foods. Scrawled on incorporation papers for Midline Holdings. Signed as leaseholder for a warehouse full of stolen, unlabeled cans. And yet, S. Carter wasn't a person, at least not one anyone could find. No driver's license. No tax filings. No social media. No paper trail. But Detective Maria Ellison had seen enough fake names to recognize a pattern. She no longer believed S. Carter was meant to be a persona. It was more like a signature left in the dust, a way of silently claiming ownership without leaving a real name behind. Still, someone somewhere had written it, registered it, and profited off of it. And she was going to find out who. Brain the linguistic thread. Ellison contacted a forensic linguist, Dr. Reuben Calloway, a specialist in handwriting and pattern recognition for fraud cases. Together, they compiled every instance of the S. Carter signature across logs, business registrations, and lease documents. Calloway noted something immediately. The S and C are always connected in the same way. The loop on the T breaks downward, not standard. Whoever wrote this was trained in commercial cursive prior to 1980. That narrowed the age range. Their suspect was likely over 50. More interesting was the signature's consistency across several states. Calloway suggested it was unlikely that multiple people were writing it. More likely, it was one person acting under a variety of shell companies. And while the identity remained unknown, the pattern suggested professional familiarity with logistics systems. Not a thief, not a driver. A dispatcher, articulated Lori, the driver who spoke. The break came from an unlikely place. A driver in rural Arkansas named Bo Allen, who was caught using a fraudulent vehicle tag tied to a stolen refrigerated truck. During interrogation, Allen claimed he didn't steal the truck. He'd been hired to drive it. The man who handed him the keys, older guy, gray goatee, went by Ski, said I'd get $200 cash and a burner phone if I dropped it in a specific parking lot in Springfield. Allen didn't know the man's real name, but he remembered the vehicle they met, in a dented 1990s blue Chevy Astro van. Ellison filed an APB. 3 weeks later, the van turned up in Fayetteville, abandoned behind a shuttered self-storage facility. Inside they found a burned-out phone, a notebook filled with codes and coordinates, a folded business card, C. Sanders Freight, Joplin, M.O. It was the first real name they'd seen. Not S. Carter, but maybe just maybe something real. Receipt a real identity emerges. C. Sanders Freight was a real company, but long defunct shuttered after a bankruptcy in 2009. Its owner, Stanley Carter Sanders, had left the freight industry after a series of fines for improper licensing and shipment misrouting. Ellison pulled court records. She traced known addresses, utility histories, and found that Sanders hadn't completely disappeared. In fact, he'd re-emerged under a variety of aliases, leasing small warehouses, incorporating shell companies, and using short-term labor to offload goods. When she located a last known address in Lebanon, Missouri, she drove out personally. The home was empty, but a neighbor retired mechanic Hal Jenkins recognized the photo. "Yeah, that's Ski," Jenkins said. "He'd come around asking if I needed bulk canned goods, said he sold surplus, cash only." Ellison asked what happened to him. "Vanished," Jenkins replied, "like a ghost." Locked the storage unit. 6 miles outside of town, at a no-frills storage complex, Ellison found something odd, a 10x15 unit under the name Charles S. Carter. She filed for a warrant. Inside, behind rusting padlocks and dust-covered tarps, was the heart of the operation. 3 broken-down pallets of generic canned food, 2 expired ID badges from Midline Holdings and Clear River Logistics, a folder of forged shipping manifests, a Rolodex filled with handwritten buyer contacts across 8 states, and taped to the back wall, a corkboard with a single piece of paper. "Never take from the big guys, just fill in the cracks." It was the manifesto of a man who had built a criminal enterprise by staying beneath the thresholds that got attention. Brain the legacy of S. Carter. Ellison eventually pieced together the timeline. Stanley Sanders, once a legitimate dispatcher, had been squeezed out of the trucking industry by rising insurance costs and regulatory changes. He rebranded, not as a smuggler, but as a parallel distributor filling orders that didn't ask questions. Over time, he developed a network of low-level drivers, short-term warehouse leases, and carefully timed diversions. He never used real names, just S. Carter, the signature that meant, "This is mine now." By 2020, Sanders would be linked unofficially to more than $2.5 million in diverted product, mostly low-value food goods. He was never arrested, never indicted. Authorities believed he fled the state, possibly to Mexico or the Caribbean. His whereabouts remain unknown. What remains in Elridge? Back in Elridge, the Granger Foods plant eventually replaced its security systems. It even upgraded to full automation, reducing overnight staff to a skeleton crew. Greg Hanlon retired in 2018. And for years, people still mentioned the soup heist, usually with a chuckle, like it was some local legend. But the case lingered in law enforcement memory. Ellison published a short paper for a criminal justice journal titled, "The Quiet Supply Chain: Crimes That Stay Invisible Because We Let Them." In it, she argued, modern systems reward efficiency over verification. When something is missing but not important enough, we let it go. Stanley Sanders didn't rob banks, he robbed attention, and that's what made him so hard to catch. Final reflection. What do we lose when we don't notice the small things going missing? And how long can someone steal quietly, slowly, before we realize the system has been rewritten? Maybe not every criminal leaves chaos behind. Some just leave a signature. And silence. In the town of Westerham, Pennsylvania, there's a bookstore that never needed to advertise. Marlowe's Books and Binders had been on Main Street since 1952, family-run, cash-preferred, and filled with the scent of yellowing paper and coffee from the old percolator behind the counter. It was the kind of place where no one asked for a receipt, and where regulars still had store credit written in pencil on index cards behind the till. So when a single decimal error appeared in the store's ledger in the fall of 2016, no one noticed at first. But the decimal didn't fix itself. And over the next 18 months, that one misplaced dot unraveled a quiet, meticulous scheme, one that would turn the town's beloved bookstore into the center of an embezzlement case that cost over $118,000 and exposed just how easy it is to hide theft in plain sight. Book's the first hint. It began with an accountant, Julian Pritchard, a semi-retired CPA and longtime Westerham resident, had offered to help the store's owner Cynthia Marlowe, now in her 70s, organize receipts for a local tax grant application. Cynthia, more interested in poetry than payroll, handed Julian a box full of ledgers, handwritten logbooks, and a thumb drive labeled Daily Sales Backup. Julian expected a weekend's worth of number crunching. Instead, on the very first night, she found a line that stuck out. Aug 3, 2016. Daily sales, $523.47. Deposit, $5.23. At first glance, it looked like a typo, a decimal in the wrong place. But when she compared the digital backup with the physical receipt log, she saw something worse. The deposit entry had been deliberately typed that way. And over the next few months of records, the same formatting appeared over and over again. Always on quiet days. Always off by a decimal point. Always rounded just enough to look forgettable. Face with monocle looking closer. Julian reviewed 18 months of entries and created 2 spreadsheets. Reported sales matched daily receipts which were logged at point of sale. Bank deposits pulled from the ledger and cross-checked against the store's monthly bank statements. The discrepancy wasn't constant, but it was patterned. Small percentages skimmed on quieter days, rounding errors that added up. $7.83 instead of $78.30. $11.50 instead of $115. 59 cents instead of $5.90. Over time, the difference amounted to over $118,000. And no one had noticed. Because the store didn't run payroll reports. Because Cynthia trusted her employees. Because no one thought a bookstore could lose that kind of money. But Julian knew better. This wasn't a mistake. It was structured fraud, slow, intentional, and hidden behind decimals. Woman office worker the suspect. The bookstore had only 3 employees. Cynthia worked most mornings. Her granddaughter, Emma, helped on weekends. And then there was Lindsay Poe, part-time manager, hired in 2015. Lindsay was efficient, courteous, and loved by the customers. She ran the register, organized events, and handled bank deposits twice a week. She also had a minor in accounting. When confronted gently by Cynthia, Lindsay was calm, surprised even. She claimed she had no idea about the errors. "It's just old software," she said. "Maybe something getting lost in export." But when Julian asked to see the raw CSV exports from the point-of-sale system, Lindsay said she had accidentally wiped the archive when updating the store laptop. That night, Julian called the POS vendor. They confirmed the system had auto backup enabled and that backups were stored to an internal directory Lindsay had manually disabled 6 months earlier. Receipt: a missing envelope. Westerham is the kind of town where even police reports feel polite. Detective Eli Hoffman, a former high school teacher turned cop, opened a case file. He requested the store's bank deposits for the period in question. The bank complied. One envelope stood out, March 14, 2017. It showed a deposit logged at $9.60, but the POS system recorded $96 in sales. The deposit slip was signed. Not by Cynthia. Not by Emma. By El Po. A review of ATM surveillance footage, grainy but time-stamped, showed Lindsay standing alone at the night deposit box that evening. She didn't drive a car. She walked from the store, alone under a streetlight, with an envelope. Chart decreasing the slow confession. When police interviewed Lindsay formally, she initially denied everything. "I did the drops, sure," she said, "but I don't fill out the slips. Cynthia does." But handwriting analysis showed otherwise. The signed deposit slips from the fraudulent days matched Lindsay's known signature on employment documents. Faced with this, she shifted her explanation. "I didn't steal it," she said. "I was keeping track of things that weren't being taxed properly. I thought I was helping, cleaning up the books." Detective Hoffman would later say, "She thought if she kept the amount small and didn't touch the busy days, no one would notice. And for a long time she was right." Brain the psychology of slow theft. Lindsay Poe wasn't desperate, she wasn't in debt, she didn't live lavishly. But over time, she admitted to pocketing small differences. When she realized Cynthia wasn't tracking daily deposits, she said it started by accident. One day she made a mistake with a decimal. She pocketed the change and no one noticed. The next week she tried it again, then again. "It was like shaking the jar of pennies," she said. "You don't miss one, you don't miss 10. When pressed, she admitted she used most of the money for nothing in particular: gifts, gas, clothes. It went so slowly, even she had trouble believing how much it added up to. Adult balance, the town reacts. Westerham was stunned. Marlowe's books had been a landmark. And Lindsay wasn't a stranger. She'd grown up just 2 towns over, worked church bake sales, and volunteered at the library. She was arrested quietly. No handcuffs in public. Just a summons, a court date, and a calm departure. The charges: theft by deception, tampering with business records, forgery. She pled guilty. The judge, nodding her cooperation and clean record, sentenced her to 18 months of probation, full restitution, and 100 hours of community service at, of all places, the town literacy center. Books. The bookstore survives. Cynthia Marlowe was heartbroken, but refused to close the shop. Instead, she digitized the entire inventory. Julian helped install modern accounting software. Emma, her granddaughter, took over the weekend deposits. The ledger still lives behind the counter, though now it's mostly ceremonial. One page is framed near the register. It shows the original entry: $5.23, the first mistake. Beneath it is a quote written in gold ink: "Truth is like a decimal out of place, small, but it shifts everything." Final reflection. We think of theft as something loud: a crash, a confrontation. But sometimes it happens in the space between digits, in quiet trust, in overlooked routines. And sometimes, all it takes to uncover a crime is paying attention to a single misplaced dot. The thing about coins is that they're easy to overlook. Pocket change rattles in trays, dimes slip through cracks, and in a world increasingly driven by digital transactions, few people stop to study what's pressed into metal. But in Grayson, Colorado, nestled in the foothills with just under 9,000 residents, coins were more than currency, they were history. And for the members of the Grayson Numismatic Society, they were obsession. That's why when a rare 1894 S. Barber dime was listed in the club's newsletter valued at nearly $1.2 million, members were astonished. And when the coin was revealed to be a forgery, the astonishment turned to suspicion. It would take years, dozens of collectors, and the quiet persistence of a retired engineer to uncover the truth. A respected club officer had been swapping genuine coins for fakes, pocketing the originals, and reselling them on the black market for over a decade. All in silence. A coin of extreme rarity. The 1894 Barber dime is one of the most elusive coins in American history. Only 24 were ever minted. Today, fewer than 10 are known to still exist. In 2018, the Grayson Numismatic Society, founded in 1971, announced it had acquired one. It was supposedly donated by Russell Kaplan, a wealthy Denver investor and former collector who had died in early 2018. In his will, he bequeathed several coins to the society, including the Barber dime, which was to be displayed in a locked glass case at the Grayson Museum. The membership was ecstatic. Photos circulated, visitors increased. But one man wasn't convinced. Magnifying glass tilted left the man who noticed. Elliot Hahn, 74, was a former aerospace engineer and longtime coin enthusiast. He had seen genuine Barber dimes up close twice in his life, and he noticed something unusual. The font on the coin's date was slightly off. The 9 was too angular, and the S mint mark had what he called a phantom serif, a tiny bump at the base, inconsistent with authentic San Francisco dies of that era. At first, he assumed it was a display error. But when he requested to examine the coin more closely, he was denied. The club's president, Robert Kelsey, said it was policy to limit handling of high-value items. Still, something bothered Hahn. He began discreetly researching. Floppy disk, the provenance gap. The coin had no paper trail. In the numismatic world, provenance is everything. $1,000,000 coins are documented meticulously: auction listings, grading certifications, sales records. But the 1894 S in Grayson had no such lineage. The only confirmation was a typed letter, allegedly from Kaplan's estate executor, stating that the coin was gifted in accordance with the decedent's wishes. Elliot tracked down the estate firm. They had no record of any coin donations. No 1894 S dime. No contact with the Grayson Numismatic Society. When Hahn raised the concern at the next club meeting, Kelsey dismissed it. Russell was a private man, he said. He didn't like paperwork. But Elliot didn't buy it. He wasn't the only one. Receipt other coins, other questions. Hahn began reviewing the club's inventory records, some going back 20 years. What he found stunned him. Several certified, high-value coins that had once been on display were now missing, marked as temporarily removed for cleaning or off-site for authentication. In their place were similar coins, but not the same ones. A 1796 draped bust quarter was now an 1805 bust quarter, similar design, much lower value. A rare 1907 $20 Gaudens ultra-high relief coin was now unavailable for viewing. A 1933 double eagle, once boasted in the club's newsletter, had disappeared altogether, loaned to a private exhibition, according to a vague note. And in each case, the change had occurred under one name. Robert Kelsey, man office worker, the president with the perfect reputation. Robert Kelsey was a founding member of the society. He had served as club president for 14 years, maintained the museum's coin display, and managed acquisitions and donations. He was also an accountant by trade, retired, meticulous, and trusted by everyone. He rarely traveled, never flaunted wealth, and kept his office neatly organized, with a wall of locked file cabinets. Elliot Hahn presented his findings to the club treasurer, Pam HSU, who agreed to quietly audit the books. What they discovered was shocking. Over $320,000 in anonymous donations were listed between 2011 and 2018 funds, with no corresponding deposits. Multiple coins had been deaccessioned without board approval. Valuation sheets had been edited, digitally backdated files modified to reflect newer, lower-value coins. And still, no one had seen Kelsey do anything overtly wrong. because Kelsey didn't steal all at once. He traded. He swapped. He replaced real with almost real. A crime committed not in theft but in exchange. Brain the long con. What made the scheme so effective wasn't just the trust Robert had built, it was the type of theft. By replacing genuine coins with replica-grade forgeries, he created the illusion that nothing had been taken. Most members couldn't tell the difference. Even experienced collectors wouldn't question a display item without close examination. Kelsey had used online dealers, rare coin auction sites, and international sellers to source high-end counterfeits legally sold as replica only, but near-identical in appearance. The originals, likely sold through private forums, cash deals, and foreign buyers where provenance could be faked. Unresolved thought. What happens when history itself is forged, piece by piece, and replaced so subtly that no one realizes it's gone? Elliot Hahn knew he couldn't go public, at least not yet. In a town like Grayson, Colorado, where everyone knew each other and reputations were currency, accusing Robert Kelsey of a decade-long fraud without irrefutable proof would be social suicide. Kelsey had spoken at the Rotary Club, donated to the library, judged the 4th of July pie contest 5 years running. He wasn't just the president of the Grayson Numismatic Society, he was the society. But as Hahn and Treasurer Pam HSU quietly compiled their evidence, ledger discrepancies, missing coins, and falsified valuations, one truth became unavoidable. The man trusted with preserving history had been rewriting it. Receipt the replicas that weren't marked. Pam took the bold step of sending one of the coins out for independent authentication. It was a 1907 Indian head $10 gold coin listed in the club's archive as graded MS-64 and allegedly certified by PCGS. When the package returned 2 weeks later, the report was brief. Non-genuine, reproduction, die strike inconsistent with known minting standards. She hadn't told anyone she'd sent it out, not even Kelsey, which meant he hadn't had time to switch it. She was holding a fake, and it had been on display for over 3 years. Another longtime member offered to have a second coin tested, a 1794 flowing hair dollar, insured by the club for nearly $80,000. That coin came back authentic, but had been cleaned improperly, reducing its value to a fraction of what was claimed in the records. Suddenly, everyone started whispering. Speech ballooned the closed-door meeting. On a rainy Thursday evening in February 2019, 5 members of the Numismatic Society met after hours at the Grayson Public Library. They didn't invite Robert Kelsey. Pam laid out her findings. Elliot presented the altered inventory logs. Another member, Fred Jacobs, revealed that a supposedly on-loan 1933 Indian Quarter Eagle had never been loaned, it was simply missing. The room was quiet. Then someone asked, "What do we do?" Adult briefcase the confrontation. The club decided to approach Robert Kelsey privately. Pam, as treasurer, asked to meet with him to review archival insurance matters. She recorded the conversation. It began professionally. Kelsey pulled out several binders, offered coffee, and made polite small talk. But when Pam asked about the 1894 S. Barber Dimes paperwork, Kelsey froze. "The paperwork," he said, "it's in the archive." "Russell Kaplan's estate has no record," she replied, "and the coin you placed on display is a replica." There was silence. Then calmly he said, "You people wouldn't have cared about that coin if I hadn't made you care." Pam pressed further, "Why lie?" "Because I spent 40 years collecting and organizing and preserving history no one appreciated," he said. "I replace things, yes, but only so we'd have something worth showing. You want to know what's really fake? The interest, the support, the funding." He didn't deny it. He didn't seem ashamed. And worst of all, he didn't seem surprised to be caught. Balance legal gray areas. The club took their findings to the Grayson Police Department. But filing criminal charges proved complicated. Here why. Many of the missing coins had never been appraised independently. The club's internal documentation was informal, often unsigned, sometimes handwritten. The display inventory had changed so gradually that ownership of certain coins could no longer be definitively proven. And most importantly, Robert Kelsey claimed he had donated or traded the original coins with other collectors for the good of the club, and that the fakes were placed in cases for display only. It was hard to prove intent to defraud, let alone outright theft, especially without a formal audit trail. The district attorney declined to prosecute. The case was never brought to court. Brain what was really lost. Robert Kelsey resigned quietly. No press release, no public announcement, just a folded letter left on the podium before the next club meeting. He moved out of town weeks later. The Grayson Numismatic Society suspended all public exhibitions. But the damage was deeper than coin loss. Pam later said, "It wasn't about money, it was about trust, and once that goes, it doesn't come back." The society lost half its members within the year. The museum removed its coin displays. The club meetings moved from the library to the back of a diner, and attendance never recovered. Package the missing inventory. Months later, an anonymous box was delivered to the Grayson Historical Society. Inside were 17 coins, all genuine. The 1933 double eagle, the 1907 high-relief St. Gaudens, a 1795 half eagle, and the real 1894 S. Barber dime. No note, no fingerprints. Just a folded invoice, dated 2008, from an online auction platform based in Germany listing Robert Kelsey as the buyer. No one could confirm if the box came from him. No one ever claimed responsibility. But there it was, returned quietly, like the crime had come full circle. Final reflection. In the end, Robert Kelsey didn't steal with violence. He didn't sell on eBay or flaunt his wealth. He swapped real for replica and counted on no one noticing. But someone did. And that's the thing about collectors. They remember details. Because to them, value lives in the fine print, in the mint mark, in the curve of a serif. And that's what finally broke the silence. High schools are filled with mysteries. Lost hall passes, scribbled messages on bathroom stalls. Locker combinations no one remembers. But at Marion Falls High School, nestled in a quiet Oregon Valley, Locker 309 wasn't just forgotten. It was deliberately ignored. For over 22 years, no student was ever assigned to it. No janitor touched it. No teacher asked about it. It sat beneath a rusted air duct in the north stairwell, an awkward corner of the school few passed unless they were lost or late. Dust gathered on its vented door. Rumors swirled. Some said it belonged to a former teacher who vanished. Others claimed it was sealed shut after something dangerous was found. But no one really knew. Until 2022. That's when a new facilities manager named Daryl Quist decided to run an audit of all unused lockers, intending to replace broken doors and clean out forgotten belongings. He jotted down 309 and reached for his master key. But when he inserted it, the lock wouldn't turn. Not because it was jammed, but because someone had welded it shut from the inside. $2 a locker out of time. The weld was precise, quiet, clean. Not the kind of work done by a student or a prankster. Whoever sealed locker 309 had known exactly what they were doing. Daryl reported it to the principal, who waved it off. Some old urban legend, she said, probably just a maintenance thing from years back. But Daryl couldn't let it go. He requested permission to force it open, citing safety concerns. 2 weeks later, with a janitor and assistant principal present, he used a metal grinder to cut through the hinges. And when the door opened, the dust came first, then the smell. Old paper, fabric rot, a faint chemical tang. Inside was a small cardboard file box, a crumpled maroon windbreaker, and a tightly sealed Ziploc bag. In the bag, a VHS cassette, a pair of broken eyeglasses, a school ID badge faded, scratched. Name Joshua L. Yates. Class of 2000. There was only one problem. Joshua Yates had never graduated. Books a forgotten student. No one on staff recognized the name. Yearbooks from the late 90s listed him only once in the sophomore class photo for 1998. No sports records, no club entries, no graduation portrait. A call to the district archive confirmed that Joshua Yates had withdrawn from school in April of his junior year. No forwarding address, no reason listed. Just withdrawn, no further record. He wasn't listed as deceased. He hadn't transferred. He had simply vanished. That was 22 years ago. Now his ID badge sat inside a locker welded shut next to a tape. Videocassette, the VHS tape. Daryl brought the contents to the local police department. Officer Shelby Martin, who'd graduated from Marion Falls herself in 2005, took the report and agreed to view the VHS cassette under controlled conditions. It was labeled only with black marker. JLY March 27, 2000. They used an old Panasonic deck in the evidence room. The tape began with static, then a grainy image, a dimly lit bedroom. The timestamp matched the label. A teenage boy appeared on screen, pale, slim, nervous. It was Joshua Yates. He spoke directly to the camera. If you're watching this, I guess they didn't listen. Or maybe I'm gone. Or maybe I finally said too much. He rambled quietly about school, about noticing things in the halls that didn't make sense. He talked about teachers with the wrong names, about classrooms that were locked but always had lights on. And then he said something strange. I left something in the locker. It's not much, but it's what I saw. They'll tell you it's fake. They'll say I made it up, but it's all I had left to prove I wasn't crazy. The rest of the tape showed a shaky, handheld walkthrough, presumably of the school building at night. The video quality was poor. The flashlight beam danced across lockers and floors. Then it stopped. A door partially open marked, records room staff only. The camera zoomed in briefly before the footage cut to black. Open file folder, the other contents. Inside the cardboard file box were a spiral notebook, water damaged but legible. Several printed photographs, developed from 35 mm film. A key on a brass chain. A folded paper map of the school, heavily marked in red ink. The notebook was a kind of journal. In it, Joshua detailed several months of observations, odd behavior by faculty, mysterious hallway detours, and something he called the double list, a ledger he claimed existed in the staff records that listed a second version of student files, containing notes that weren't meant for guidance counselors. One entry read, "They call it the shadow list. Mine says, redacted, holds visual proof, monitor closely." The photographs were difficult to interpret. Blurry images of hallway doors ajar, a dark room with stacked boxes, what looked like a computer terminal screen, green text on black, too fuzzy to read. The brass key had no label. The map unfolded showed a part of the school no longer in use. The subbasement, sealed off after flooding damage in 2004. Joshua had circled one room, labeled in shaky handwriting, double list server room. Unresolved thought. Why would a high school student document and then hide his suspicions only to disappear shortly after. And why, more than 2 decades later, is that locker only now being opened? Schools, like old buildings, are layered. Generations walk the same halls, administrators change, custodians repaint. But beneath every renovation is what's left behind. And at Marion Falls High School, that included an entire sub-basement level abandoned, sealed, and mostly forgotten, until the discovery of Locker 309 and a folded, hand-marked map that led straight to it. World the sub-basement no one talks about. According to school renovation logs, Marion Falls had suffered extensive water damage in 2004 when a frozen pipe burst during spring break. The custodial wing, old storage areas, and the original AV tech room were all located in the sub-basement at that time. Rather than fully restore it, the district opted to seal the lower level, citing mold concerns and structural instability. Few remembered it existed. The stairwell entrance near the north wing had been plastered over. The elevator no longer serviced the B level. But the blueprint in Joshua Yates' notebook clearly showed a secondary access point, a narrow maintenance tunnel behind the boiler room. Key the door that did belong. Detective Shelby Martin, with consent from the district, returned to the school accompanied by facilities manager Darrell Quist and 2 officers from the county sheriff's office. They followed the map, pushing aside rusted carts and cleaning supplies in the long-forgotten back of the boiler room. Behind a sheet of warped plywood, they found a narrow steel door, heavy, bolted shut. Darrell used a pry bar to force it open. The tunnel beyond was damp, dust-choked, and barely wide enough to walk. They descended for 40 feet before reaching another door. This one was locked with a padlock. Darrell pulled out the brass key from locker 309. It turned, and the door swung open. Desktop the room with no name. The space inside wasn't large, maybe 15 feet square. But what it contained made everyone stop. Against one wall sat an old server rack, powered down but still wired into the wall. Dust coated every surface. Tangled cables snaked across the floor. A metal desk was bolted into place, with a single CRT monitor mounted on an arm above it. On the opposite wall, 6 file cabinets, each labeled in faded Sharpie. AC, DF, GJ, KM, NS, TZ. The drawers were full of student records, but not normal ones. Each file folder had a handwritten name and a second label beneath it. Level 1, Risk Mild Behavioral. Level 2, Monitor Social Isolated. Level 3, Unstable Family Unknown Surveillance. Level 4, Redacted Direct Contact Restricted. The names included students who had attended as recently as 2018, long after the sub-basement was supposedly sealed. One of the files bore a familiar name. Joshua L. Yates, Level 4. Redacted, holds contraband copy, locker isolated. Brain a system no one admitted. When asked, current administrators insisted they had no knowledge of the room, the server, or the secondary files. Principal Deirdre Rule, visibly shaken after viewing the contents, said, "This isn't part of anything I've ever seen in my tenure, and I've been here since 2006. District officials were called in, lawyers followed, and the room was sealed again, this time by police order. But before it was closed, Detective Martin requested access to the server. Darrell was able to boot it, though the hardware groaned. A terminal interface blinked to life. A single prompt appeared. Login. Password. Darrell attempted a bypass. After 20 minutes, he was in. He navigated directories labeled. Read files. The contents were encrypted, but logs showed that the system had been accessed as recently as 15 months ago. Someone still used this room. page facing up the red files. A few files had been saved as plaintext backups. One was titled, JLY Note Final TXT. It was a brief memo, no signature, no header. Student has obtained video of internal restricted area. Claimed footage includes unauthorized hallway entry. File could not be verified due to missing tape. Recommended to monitor locker, restrict staff access, and suspend ID without formal expulsion. Note student has no guardian on file. Status, low media risk. The implication was horrifying. Joshua Yates had not transferred, not withdrawn, not run away. He had been removed quietly under a system no one wanted to admit existed. School, a hidden discipline system. Investigative journalists picked up the story. An anonymous teepster, later believed to be a retired school counselor, contacted one of the outlets. They claimed that in the late 1990s, several districts had experimented with internal behavioral risk indexing, systems meant to track students who might be disruptive, violent, or mentally unstable. But rather than operate transparently, these systems were used covertly. Students were flagged, monitored, sometimes encouraged to leave, other times quietly isolated. None of this was illegal, barely. But it wasn't supposed to be done in secret. And it certainly wasn't supposed to be handled through undocumented storage rooms below public buildings. What had started as a behavior watch program had morphed into something far more disturbing. A hidden shadow archive, operated by just a few unknown staff over 2 decades. Adult graduation, where was Joshua Yates? Despite renewed investigation, no trace of Joshua ever surfaced. No death certificate. No adult identification. No credit history. Some theorized he had changed his name. Others believed he had been institutionalized or worse. But one clue remained. In the final pages of his notebook, he wrote, "I'm leaving this because I know I'm not the only one. They think we don't notice, but we do. I might be gone, but I'll leave the map, the box, the tape. If you find this, don't let them erase it again." Locker 309 isn't empty. It's a reminder. Unresolved thought. If a public institution can build an entire system to monitor, isolate, and erase people quietly, carefully, how many other Joshua Yates stories are buried behind welded doors? Some stories end in arrests. Some in trials, confessions, or long overdue justice. But others, like the mystery of Joshua Yates, end not with resolution, but with the uneasy knowledge that something once buried was brought back into the light, and then quietly covered again. What came after the locker was opened at Marion Falls High School was not a reckoning. It was something far quieter, and in many ways more unsettling. Newspaper, the public response. When the local paper, the Marion Herald, first published its piece titled "The Forgotten Locker," the response was immediate, though restrained. Parents demanded answers. Former student submitted freedom of information requests. District officials released a vague statement citing historic storage anomalies and unauthorized data archiving, without acknowledging specifics. But once national media picked it up, the school changed its tone. The district superintendent announced an independent third-party review of school records going back to 1995. A press conference was held. The word accountability was used 8 times. But no one admitted who had built the sub-basement server room. No one explained who had kept accessing it. And most disturbingly, no one said Joshua Yates' name. Adult balance, the internal investigation. The investigation, conducted by a contracted education oversight firm, took 4 months. Their report concluded the sub-basement archive room was likely created as a records overflow facility after a 1996 administrative building fire. The room was repurposed in the early 2000s by unknown personnel for behavioral tracking. No current staff were found responsible. Access logs showed at least 27 individual system logins between 2003 and 2021, none tied to current user IDs. Physical files from 1997-2018 showed non-standard categorization practices. But no one was named. The report recommended destroying all unauthorized records and disabling unused infrastructure to prevent confusion. In short, seal the door again, burn the files, pretend it never happened. Fire, but the files didn't burn. Detective Shelby Martin, no longer satisfied with the district's cooperation, made her own copies of the key contents. With help from Daryl Quist, she digitized the files including Joshua's journal pages, the recovered photographs, video of the locker being opened, screenshots of the sub-basement system. She provided them to the county archive under sealed reference, marked for release upon official request. She also shared them with a regional investigative podcast off the record, which aired a 6-part series called Student 309, The Vanishing of Joshua Yates. The episodes didn't go viral, but they sparked something else. Other former students began calling in. Telephone receiver the calls that followed. A dozen calls came in over the next month. Former students from the late 90s and early 2000s, each with a variation of the same story. I got pulled from gym class once and told I needed to reset my schedule. I was never allowed back into the art room. My locker was changed mid-year for safety reasons. No explanation. I found a note in my file during a college application meeting. It said, "Monitor for signs of isolation, family unresponsive." No one could tell me what it meant. I knew Joshua not well, but he was smart. Weird, he filmed stuff. None of these stories were smoking guns. But together, they painted a picture of a school where some students were quietly tracked not through grades or attendance, but through behavior. And it was done without their knowledge. And sometimes without their families either. The Candlelight Meeting. In May of 2023, a group of alumni held a vigil on the front steps of Marion Falls High School. Not for a tragedy, not for a scandal, but for recognition. They read aloud the names of students from the school's records who were marked as withdrawn between 1995 and 2005. There were 73 names. Of those, 11 had no graduation or transfer records anywhere in the state database. No forwarding addresses. Some, like Joshua, had simply vanished from the system. One participant, now a social worker, said, "We were kids. We didn't ask why things were happening, but now, as adults, we realize how many things didn't make sense." No administrators attended. No official acknowledgement was given. But the town noticed. The school stayed quiet. Luggage the final envelope. In late June, as renovations were beginning on the school's science wing, a custodian found a plain envelope tucked inside the ceiling tiles above room B103. Inside was a single Polaroid. It showed a younger version of Joshua Yates standing outside the school holding up a small cardboard sign. It read, "I still see it." On the back, in ink faded to sepia. "Not missing, just not seen." There was no return address, no message. It was turned over to Detective Martin, who chose not to log it into evidence. Instead, she pinned it to her office corkboard, above a post-it that reads, "Some things don't get solved, but that doesn't mean they weren't real." Brain, a legacy of silence. By 2024, Marion Falls High School had a new principal. The server room was bricked over. Locker 309 was removed, replaced with a blank panel in the wall. But students still ask about it. And some teachers quietly will tell them, "It was just a rumor." Others say nothing, but a few, those who have been around long enough, pause before answering, because they know that Joshua Yates never got to finish school, and because somewhere in the shadows of institutional memory, his name still echoes, not just as a missing student, but as a reminder. That silence, when organized carefully enough, can become policy, and that sometimes it takes an unlocked door to break it. Final reflection. Some crimes leave no fingerprints, only gaps. And sometimes, a student's empty locker tells more about a system than all the files that went missing with it. Some crimes aren't violent. They don't make headlines. They unfold in places meant to be peaceful, where people go to rest, not to be robbed. At Willow Glen Retirement Village, nestled between the pines of rural Vermont, comfort was more than a promise. It was part of the branding. Handwritten newsletters, midday tea, warm lighting in every hallway. The kind of place where birthdays were announced with cupcakes and piano recitals. But behind those walls, someone had been stealing. Not fast, not loud. Not in a way anyone noticed. Until one resident asked a question that would unravel a 10-year fraud, affect dozens of families, and reveal the unsettling ease with which trust could be systematically drained, one transaction at a time. Receipt: the first suspicion. Her name was Margaret Tolliver, 84 years old. Sharp-minded, recently widowed, and a former bookkeeper for a local nursery business, she didn't like letting others handle her finances. But at Willow Glen, most residents enrolled in the Optional Expense Management Program, OEMP, a convenient service for managing medication copays, on-site meals, entertainment fees, and small errands. Her children encouraged her to sign up, and for a while it seemed helpful. But in October 2021, Margaret noticed a charge on her internal statement. Community event, $46.80. She hadn't attended any community event. And the charges continued each month. $22.50, $31.40, $19.25. Always vague, always labeled group services. She requested an itemized breakdown. The front desk handed her a 2-page printout, generic categories, no vendor names. And that's when she decided to do what she had done for decades: balance the books. Chart decreasing a pattern in the paper. Over the next 2 months, Margaret tracked every expense. She recorded her outings, kept receipts, compared her purchases to the monthly deductions. By January 2022, she had identified $178.95 in unexplained charges and 4 duplicate entries for a pharmacy pickup fee on days she didn't receive medication. She took her findings to the on-site manager, Rebecca Lutz, a cheerful woman in her early 50s with a background in hospitality. Lutz explained that charges were grouped for convenience, based on a shared services model. But Margaret didn't let it go. She asked a different question. Who's auditing this system? File folder in outsider's eye. Margaret's daughter, Corinne Tolliver, was a licensed CPA living in nearby Montpelier. She agreed to look over the documentation. Corinne noticed something immediately. The system used to track OEMP charges was a proprietary software platform maintained off-site, and monthly statements were generated not by Willow Glen, but by a third-party bookkeeping firm in Albany, NY, called Alder and Finch Services. Yet Alder and Finch had no website, no registered LLC status in New York State, and no contact information other than a P.O. box and a Gmail address. Corinne sent an email. No response. She called the number on the statement. Disconnected. So she looked deeper. She searched tax records, business registries, and financial disclosures. And what she found was chilling. Alder and Finch had been billing over $32,000 per year in administrative processing fees to Willow Glen for nearly 11 years. Speech balloon, the residents remember. Once word got out quietly, between tea breaks and game nights, other residents started checking their statements. A man named Edward Griggs discovered he'd been charged a monthly transportation fee, even though he hadn't left the building in over a year. Dorothy Wynn, 91, found charges for IT assistance every 3 months despite not owning a computer. No one had questioned these line items before. The charges were small, routine, wrapped in official-sounding labels. And for residents whose average age was 83, most of whom trusted staff implicitly, no red flags had ever been raised. Until Margaret did. Adult balance whistleblowing. Karen took her findings to the Vermont State Attorney General's office in March 2022. The investigation began quietly. A financial crimes analyst reviewed 10 years of transaction records and identified a discrepancy totaling $408,000 unaccounted for, misclassified, or duplicated across services. Meanwhile, Willow Glen's management was completely unaware. Why? Because the bookkeeping had been outsourced during a management transition in 2010, part of a cost-saving measure to reduce payroll and avoid internal audits. And the company they chose? Alder and Finch Services. But there was no company. Alder and Finch was a shell account, created and operated by the former facilities director, Gene Moreland, who had retired in 2018. He had set up the account using a fake business license, opened a bank account under the company name, and billed the facility monthly, all under the guise of service aggregation. Each charge was minor, $2 here, $6 there. But over time, and across 74 residents, it added up. Who was Gene Moreland? By the time the fraud was discovered, Gene had relocated to Palm Coast, Florida, living in a gated retirement community under his own name. He had no prior criminal record, no history of financial misconduct. He'd been well liked by staff, jovial, quiet. When detectives finally interviewed him in June 2022, he said, "I didn't think anyone would notice, and if they did, I figured it wasn't enough to go to jail for." He admitted everything. But due to the small amounts per transaction, the statute of limitations had already expired on the bulk of the fraud. Only the final 18 months of charges, about $55,000, remained within prosecutable range. Gene was arrested for theft by deception and elder financial exploitation. He posted bail within 24 hours. His sentencing was scheduled for March 2023. Older adult Margaret's impact. Back at Willow Glen, things began to change. The OEMP was suspended indefinitely. All residents received full reimbursement for the final 2 years of improper charges. Internal audits were mandated quarterly by the new management team. A plaque was added near the lobby fireplace, in honor of Margaret Tolliver, who kept the books honest. Margaret still lives there. She still plays bridge, still corrects crossword clues when she hears someone get them wrong. And every month, she balances her own expenses by hand. Unresolved thought. If one man could create a fake company, hide hundreds of thousands of dollars in plain sight, and go unnoticed for over a decade, how many others are still doing the same, just waiting for someone like Margaret to notice? In most true crime stories, trials are dramatic. Televised hearings, crowded courtrooms, emotional testimonies. But when elder financial abuse is involved, especially slow, quiet schemes that unfold over years, justice rarely arrives with fanfare. In Gene Moreland's case, It arrived in the form of a one-day bench trial in a small Vermont courtroom. No reporters, no family present, no residents from Willow Glen in the gallery. Only a few prosecutors, a tired defense attorney, and a gray-haired defendant in a navy blue cardigan, more librarian than criminal. But what Gene did over 10 years was more insidious than flashy. He used trust as a tool, and quietness as cover. Clipboard the charges. Gene Moreland was charged with theft by deception, over $25,000, a Class B felony; exploitation of vulnerable adults, a charge under Vermont Statute 33 VSA Section 6902; operating a business without a license, a misdemeanor, but one that painted the paper trail. Because most of the theft occurred before 2020, the statute of limitations barred prosecution for roughly 80% of the total fraud. What remained were the final 18 months, roughly $55,600, spread across dozens of microtransactions. Still, the case was strong. Gene had already confessed in a recorded interview. He had created false invoices, sent them from an unregistered Gmail, and deposited the checks in a Wells Fargo account under the alias Alder and Finch. Adult balanced the courtroom day. The trial took place on March 3, 2023, in Washington County Superior Court. Judge Diane Leavitt presided, known for her quiet efficiency. Prosecutor Lena Rollins opened with a simple statement. This is not a crime of passion. It is not a mistake. It is a long, deliberate erosion of trust. She walked the court through the records, selecting small examples. A $4.20 charge for meal supplement, billed to a diabetic resident who had passed away 3 weeks earlier. A $12 delivery fee, billed 3 times in a week to the same person. Duplicate entries, mislabeling, and bundled service charges no one ever authorized. Gene's defense attorney, a court-appointed public defender named Alan Coates, didn't contest the facts. Instead, he argued for leniency. Mr. Moreland is 68 years old. He has no criminal record. He has repaid a portion of the funds voluntarily. He never stole large sums, and he never threatened or coerced anyone. He committed a crime, yes, but one born not of malice but of quiet opportunity. Older adult Margaret testifies. Though she had not planned to attend, Margaret Tolliver chose to testify. Wearing a pressed suit and carrying her original ledger notebook, she walked slowly to the stand. Her voice, clear and unwavering, delivered a precise summary of the harm done. It wasn't about the money, not for me, but I know people here who skipped medication copays because they couldn't figure out why their bills were so high. He didn't take from the rich. He took from people who didn't even know how to ask the right question. That's not just theft, that's betrayal. Her words hung heavy in the otherwise silent courtroom. Gene avoided eye contact. Balance the verdict. Judge Leavitt returned a verdict before lunch. Guilty on both felony counts. Guilty on the misdemeanor. At sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge declined the prosecution's request for the maximum. Instead, Gene received 4 years in prison, with 2 years suspended, eligible for parole after 14 months. Full restitution of $55,600 to be repaid over 5 years. Permanent ban from working with or managing finances for any vulnerable adults. It wasn't the harshest sentence, but it was, Margaret later said, enough. Dollar banknote, where did the money go? Curiously, Gene hadn't spent lavishly. When his assets were audited, he had no second home, no luxury car, no visible debts. Instead, the funds had accumulated in a personal investment account, earning modest interest. He told investigators, it was a backup plan, retirement padding, I didn't think I'd need to use it. In a twisted way, it was his own version of a pension one he built by siphoning pennies from the elderly. Adult handshake, adult impact on the community. Willow Glen underwent serious changes in the months following the trial. They hired a certified internal auditor. Monthly statements were now reviewed by a family liaison committee, including adult children of residents. Third-party services required registration with state regulators. Residents were encouraged to opt out of pooled billing. 2 other facilities under the same parent company were also quietly audited. No additional fraud was found, but confidence had been shaken. "This was a home," said Edward Griggs, the resident who'd been overcharged for transportation. "Now I'm not sure what to call it." Received the quiet checks. Each affected resident or their family received a check in the mail that spring. Small amounts: $94.15, $203.44, $63. Margaret received $187.12. But some of the recipients were already deceased. Their families confused. The explanation vague. "Due to accounting errors, we are refunding a portion of previously assessed administrative charges." No mention of fraud. No mention of Jean Moreland. Just one sentence at the bottom: "We value your continued trust." Fountain Margaret's final entry. The last entry in Margaret Tolliver's ledger notebook reads, March 24 check received, case closed. Total recovered, 187.12. But the real value wasn't money, it was the reminder that even the smallest theft, left unchecked, becomes a lie we all live under. She folded the notebook, placed it in a drawer, and went back to her book club. Because, in her words, some crimes don't need rage, they need persistence. Unresolved thought. If a man can quietly siphon away money in a building full of witnesses and nearly get away with it, how many other Jean Morelands are hiding behind ordinary job titles? Hopping no one adds the numbers up. When the checks were cashed, the trial concluded and the headlines faded. What few existed. Many assumed the story of Jean Moreland was over. But in truth, his crime was only the surface scratch of a much larger vulnerability, one that reached far beyond the walls of Willow Glen Retirement Village and into the very heart of elder care in America. Jean didn't invent the system he exploited. He simply understood that the people inside it rarely asked questions. The problem no one regulates. Across the United States, over 800,000 seniors live in assisted living facilities. Roughly 65% of them enroll in some kind of in-house billing or management service, allowing the facility to schedule medical deliveries, manage prescription copays, handle transportation costs, organize meal plans or recreational services. In theory, it's convenience. In practice, it's a system that operates on total trust. Unlike hospitals or nursing homes, most private retirement communities are lightly regulated, especially when it comes to internal financial practices. They fall into a gray zone between healthcare and hospitality. And it's in that gray zone that people like Jean Moreland thrive. It wasn't embezzlement from a business, explained Vermont State Auditor Renee Jeffries. It was embezzlement from individuals scattered across hundreds of low-dollar entries. No one noticed because no one wanted to look that closely. Brain the legislative echo. The case might have ended quietly if not for Corinne Tolliver, Margaret's daughter, who used her accounting background to lobby for change. She partnered with Elder Justice Vermont, a nonprofit focused on protecting vulnerable adults. Together, they drafted and introduced a bill in the state legislature. H.274, the Resident Financial Transparency Act. Key provisions included requiring quarterly external audits for any assisted living facility, managing resident funds, mandating itemized billing disclosures with vendor contact information, establishing a public reporting system for suspected financial abuse, banning facility employees from holding positions with third-party billing entities. The bill passed with near-unanimous support in June 2023. Other states took notice. Massachusetts, Oregon, and Minnesota introduced similar legislation. Speech balloon quiet stories begin to emerge. Following the bill's passage, Elder Justice Vermont opened a hotline. In the first 3 months, they received 221 calls from across the country. A man in Indiana whose mother's emergency transport charges included $280 for a single wheelchair transfer. A woman in Georgia who discovered her father's meal plan had doubled in price without any change in food service. A widow in Maine who found $17 monthly fees for a digital learning subscription he never signed up for. Most cases weren't criminal. Many were clerical errors. But each call told the same story. Residents didn't know what they were paying for, and facilities weren't required to explain. Counterclockwise arrows button Willow Glen 1 year later. By spring 2024, Willow Glen had changed. A third-party firm audited all OEMP records going back 15 years. A new chief compliance officer was hired. Family members could now log into a secure portal to review monthly statements in real time. Each charge required a digital signature or verbal consent, recorded by staff. Residents were given the option to manage their own services independently, with free workshops on how to do so. Margaret, now 85, became something of a celebrity in the hallways. "We've got a Margaret Claus now," the front desk staff joked. "Nothing gets billed without 3 eyes on it." She shrugs off the attention. "All I did was ask why my receipt didn't match the charges." Anyone could have done that, they just didn't. Laptop computer, the digital vulnerability. One troubling revelation in the Moreland investigation was the software itself. The billing system used by Willow Glen was a lightweight platform called CareTrack, plus a tool marketed as streamlined expense integration for aging populations. It had no two-factor authentication, no built-in fraud alerts, and no audit trail for manual entry edits. The developers, a small vendor in upstate New York, had never faced scrutiny. That changed after Corinne Tolliver testified before the Vermont Senate Committee on Aging. She showed how CareTrack Plus allowed back-end fee creation with no timestamp tracking, meaning Gene could add phantom services, duplicate existing charges, delete log entries if questioned, all without detection. The company quietly issued an update patch a month later. No admission of fault, just a vague note, enhancing user accountability controls. Brain the psychology of quiet theft. Financial crimes against the elderly are rarely violent, but they are deeply psychological. They rely on cognitive trust. Many seniors grew up in an era where paperwork and official-sounding language carried weight. Social isolation, fewer visitors or outside eyes to review documents. Fear of confrontation. Many residents don't want to cause trouble. Delegation of control. Adult children often assume the bills are correct. As Margaret once said, "We don't ask questions because we think the people running things know better, but they only know what we let them get away with." Classical where it all lands. Gene Moreland served 16 months before being released on parole in summer 2024. He now lives in an assisted living facility in North Carolina. Ironically, one where he's no longer allowed to manage his own billing. He declined interviews. He made no public apology. But perhaps the most telling detail was found in a letter submitted during his parole hearing. It read in part, "I thought of it as rounding errors. It didn't feel like theft. I never meant to hurt anyone." The letter was unsigned. It ended with a single sentence. "I see now that silence is a kind of permission.